Nancy. Welcome to Syracuse.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for having accepted to dialogue about a few subjects. The first subject I would like to address is the presence of the therapist. I know that you consider yourself a faithful psychoanalyst to Freud, and that you experience the original theory and method like a method that has already many things, and so you like to be faithful to ethical presence and also warm and sensitive presence. And we know that Gestalt therapy is also characterized by a more active, let's say creative, active presence. And this might seem different, a different approach to the client, to our clients. So I just wanted to dialogue with you about that. If you want to say something, what is the psychoanalytical presence?
Well, it's an interesting question. You characterized me as faithful to Freud, and I am faithful to certain elements in Freud that are important to me, including his deep curiosity, his respect for patients. When hysterical women were being treated as if they were just making it all up, he took their suffering seriously, and he learned from them a way of helping them. So there was, despite many areas in which he was not at all modest, there was a humility about his willingness to learn from the patient. And I've always felt there's a difference between a psychoanalytic sensibility and a particular technique. It's my understanding that the Gestalt movement was partly an effort to correct the tendency among many psychoanalysts to make a fetish out of a particular version of psychoanalytic technique. They often quoted some things that Freud had said about that made it sound very sterile and medical, because, at least in the United States, medicine was under some attack, and they were trying to show how systematic and sterile they were, that this was really a teachable technique. And I think there have been many negative effects to trying to define psychoanalysis according to a technique. At the same time, I was personally very helped by a psychoanalyst who had a fairly traditional technique. He did not speak much. When he did, he would just help me explore more deeply. He kept an eye on what I think he thought was a resistance to my opening myself up, but he didn't bomb me with interpretations the way I've known some analysts to do. So I think there's something about any good therapist that involves some qualities that Freud had, which is an I-thou relationship, as Martin Buber would say, that kind of ethical presence, a respect for the patient, deep curiosity, and willingness to acknowledge what you don't know. I always admired Freud for changing his theory over time when he felt there was a problem with it.
And a very professional and dedicated attitude to the client, like Freud wrote about his clients a lot.
Yes, and seemed to be genuinely interested in them and caring about them. So those are the things that I identified with. I've always been very uncomfortable with the sort of, I think of it as a perversion of the original psychoanalytic presence. To try to say that there's a particular type of therapy, and it's the best therapy. And if you do less than 4 times a week on the couch with the therapist behind the patient, it's not true psychoanalysis. I think that's a misunderstanding.
Yes. The criticism to psychoanalysis and to society from where Gestalt therapy comes from is more criticism to society that doesn't support aggression,
Yes.
healthy aggression in citizens, in individuals. So they started with a criticism to rules, social rules, and not supporting the individual power to develop their own idea and to give their own contribution, creative contribution to society.
Yes.
And they assimilated this to psychoanalysis because they thought that psychoanalysis teaches the client to know everything about themselves, and they don't support this aggression, this creative part of the individual. So that's where Gestalt therapy comes from, to that kind of criticism, which is very much connected to society.
Yes, and I never understood it that way. That's interesting. I didn't really see. There is within psychoanalysis some similar critiques, like by this. You've mentioned them in your own writing, the Sullivanians, for example, or the. I don't know if you know the work of the modern psychoanalyst Spotnitz and that group. I had the same reservation, but I had not understood that was the foundation of the Gestalt critique.
Yes. And then it brought it was very much in line with narcissistic society, because this supported a lot the narcissistic wish to do their own things. And then so after 20 years or 30 years in the 80s, this was not up to date anymore.
Yes.
Because we needed to find other ways a way of be present with clients. We could not stress always the autonomy and the creative aggression of the person, because the clinical evidence changed, the client changed, and so the client became less structured, more fragile. And so if you tell to a fragile person, be creative, do whatever you want, and there is not enough support in the experiential ground of the person, then that person cannot do that unless he or she splits and becomes aggressive and not empathetic.
Yes, they get into a self-state where it's narcissistic entitlement rather than healthy aggression in one of their self-states, and a terrible depletion and incapacity in another, and both of them are torture.
Yes. So I think in Gestalt therapy we developed a lot from that original fixed, creative, aggressive attitude to a more adjusted to new clients attitude. And so today we think that what is very important is that the presence of the therapist has to support the experiential ground of the person.
Yes.
Because, for a borderline, for instance, the borderline is debating between good and bad parts. So they cannot choose what they want, who they are, and the therapist has to support the ground experience, like the relational experience.
Yes.
I am here to listen to you. I'm here to maybe also to tell you what I feel when you do some certain things. I'm here to remake a story, a relational story with you.
Yes.
So,
well, as you know, there's a convergence there of the correctives to early psychoanalysis of contemporary relational psychoanalysis and intersubjective psychoanalysis that's also adapted perhaps a little bit less self-consciously about what it was in the society that they were responding to, but that has gone in the direction of sometimes affective self-disclosure, much more appreciation of the therapist's inevitable involvement in the process as opposed to being an objective observer outside the individual. Mm-hmm. So there is some convergence there of a sense of there needing to be a more alive other person in a related matrix.
Yes, to revise the concept of neutrality, for
Yes.
instance, in psychoanalysis. Yeah?
Yes.
So, can you say something about the neutrality in psychoanalysis?
Well, I don't have a problem with what I understood to be neutrality, but I have a big problem with how it was often defined. I always liked Anna Freud's definition, which is the therapist should try to maintain an equidistant position between the id, the ego, and the superego. So you don't uncritically support the person's drives, like if they have a drive toward a sexual object that would be problematic in some way. You don't support their drive unambivalently. You don't support all the realistic reasons why it's a problem unambivalently. And you don't come in on the side of their superego and start moralizing to them about how bad it would be to behave. You take an equidistant position of curiosity, trying to open things up. But I think the term neutrality has often meant to people something rather different from what Anna Freud defined, which is a kind of effort to erase the therapist as a person, to be so blank that there's a kind of denial that this is a two-person activity.
Yes.
And I know many people who've had analyses with therapists who wouldn't answer a question because of some sense that would violate a rule of neutrality, wouldn't ever say something about themselves, even if the patient was asking a simple question like, have you seen such and such a movie? Because the patient wanted to talk about the movie, and it would be helpful to know whether the analyst had seen it. So I've always had a problem with rigidity in psychoanalysis or anything. But neutrality has been a particularly badly interpreted construct, I think.
Our position as Gestalt therapists is to create a contact boundary with the client. So to experience a new way of making contact in the here and now. We are phenomenological. Mm-hmm. So we work on the process of contact in the here and now. And so if a client has an issue about sexuality, what we look is how he tells how's that.
Yes.
The how. And so we experience what we feel when the client tells in that way. And this is the basic. These are the basic elements for us to understand the contact boundary that client and therapist are building together. And the intention of the therapist is to remake a story, to remake a better possibility for the client to make contact with more spontaneity.
Yes.
I think this can be very much connected with the attachment theory.
Very much, which has also been, I'm having a fly here.
Yes.
That's also been very influential for the relational psychoanalyst as well, who would describe that you get into a relationship with someone and you understand that the two of you will end up enacting some themes from the client's history, but it's your job to make them come out differently by understanding your own role in the process as well as what the patient brings to the process.
So you feel you do the same or similar thing when you are in front of a client? Do you think in terms of present moment, of the here and now, and what you're both doing, or you're more focused on the interpreting what the client says?
I think it partly depends upon the client. Mostly, I try to approach clinical work with my natural curiosity about how to understand this person, how to try to feel that person's suffering. And I think that's a process that goes on all through the therapy. It's not like you figure it out and then you have your interventions. I'm more likely not to interpret so much as raise a question. I wonder if the reason that you do this has something to do with your mother. What comes to your mind about that? Or I feel as if when you and I are in this conversation, it's as if we are a mother, a critical mother and a defensive daughter. Is that how you're feeling as well? Is that what's going on now? And how can we find a different way to experience this? So yes, I think I've been very influenced.
Yes, because we think in terms of bodily experience.
Yes.
And so we know that the way this client is with the therapist has been learned in the past, in the previous contact.
I think we're behind you there, because I think psychoanalytic attention to the body is it's getting to be a very hot topic in the field, but it's been slow. It's come mostly through the experience of working with people with serious trauma, where their body has been very closed down in certain ways. And the only way to feel that is to feel your own body in relationship to the client. So I think you've been aware of this for much longer than we have. Psychoanalysis tilts toward being overly intellectual and overly about understanding cognitively, sometimes at the expense of raw re-experience.
Yeah, that's we have been influenced by Reich.
Yes.
And, character armor.
Yes.
That we call retroflexion. No?
Yes.
It's a system of retroflecting. Okay. So another thing I wanted to talk with you is about the new clients and the new clinical evidences, which, as we were telling before, it's more on the side of personality disorders, so less neurotic, more serious disturbances.
Yes.
Not psychotic, but personality disorders. And so this changes our concept of borderline also, because first borderline clients were those who were not neurotic and nor psychotic, but now, with many studies by Kernberg and others, we know that the structure of the experience of a borderline can be various. It can be of various types, and it's a particular kind of suffering.
Yes.
So how do you define the borderline suffering?
I think there's a very profound identity disturbance, both in terms of being able to integrate good self-states with bad self-states, but also being able to feel some continuity in time, that you are the person who was once a little child, and you can imagine yourself going forward in the future, because borderline people get frozen in the present. And also a kind of integration between the psychological self and the body, because many people with borderline diagnoses treat their body as a foreign object. You can burn it, you can cut it, you can starve it. So there's an identity problem that splits off aspects of experience into disowned states that need to be integrated. I think I've been very influenced by Kernberg's observation about the defenses that are characteristic of people with borderline psychology, splitting, which goes with what I just said.
Primitive defenses.
But primitive defenses generally extreme denial, extreme idealization or devaluation. I would say dissociation also, omnipotent control, projective identification, or primitive forms of projection and introjection, and withdrawal. Some people simply go away, they go inside. So those things can be profoundly negative in their consequences. If somebody uses a lot of splitting, people end up hating them and they don't quite get why. If they use a lot of withdrawal, they become extremely isolated socially. If they use a lot of primitive projection, they are experienced as paranoid, and so people end up mistreating them in the ways that they expect to be mistreated. So those things have influenced me a lot. The type of suffering is, I think Masterson captured something with the idea of abandonment, despair. I think they have a terrible problem in the separation individuation field, or in the what Panksepp calls the panic system, the attachment separation system. When they are close to people, they feel controlled and they have to fight their way out from under. And when they are too distant, they feel devastatingly alone and abandoned. And both of those states of mind, of being controlled by others and dominated, or being completely alone and neglected, are extremely toxic to all mammals.
And also the anger, like I think Gunderson said.
Yes.
The anger. It's a beautiful description of the borderline experience, the borderline client. In Gestalt therapy, we draw to Isidor Fromm's lesson, and he said that he focused more on the intentionality because a phenomenological concept. Mm-hmm. So what he said is that the borderline client failed, of course, in having an integrated sense of self, and they could manage to have a sketch of self.
A sketch
of self.
Very nice.
And they work hard to keep this sketch of self. So what he was underlying was this intentionality of keeping the sketch of self. So they have to protect themselves from the other, from the invasion of the other, and they have to protect this sketch of self. And they do this with dignity. They do this with a beauty, with an artistic way.
Yes.
You like this?
I do, because I always look for ways to understand what's the patient's achievement, what is the health-seeking element in something that can look so pathological from the outside. What problem is the patient trying to solve? And a very talented observer or therapist can see the beauty in this kind of...
Yes. Like, for instance, a borderline client, sits and he looks sad, and you say, "You look sad today," and he tells you, "No, I'm not sad." Yeah. And then after a little while he says, "I'm sad today," because they don't want to be defined by the other. They want to be the one who says how they feel. And they do it with anger. I mean, the anger is also a sort of support to their keeping the sketch of self. That's what they have, the tool they have.
That's their version of self-respect. That's a very nice way to think about it.
Yeah, so the example that I make, as you know, is that a client tells the therapist after a session where there was some warmth, and the therapist thought this is a good session. And they saw the client very fluid and very warm, and he thought this was a good session. But then, of course, the client has a second reaction.
That reaction is always dangerous. Oh, wonderful session.
Yes, and the client feels the need to protect from the potential intrusion of the other. So does something negative, like disturbing the therapist, calling the therapist at midnight or at 2 a.m. because he feels bad. And so the next session, after this night phone calls, the therapist is disturbed, If he would be the old Gestalt therapist, he would trust this anger, and he would say, "You shouldn't have called me last night." But if he knows he has developed the concept of his present with the borderline, the borderline clients, he will look at the beauty how the client says that, like I will never trust you again, and he says that with a sort of dignity. So the Gestalt therapist sees the anger, the strange behavior of the borderline client like a defense for his sketch of self. And second, he looks at this harmony, at this artistic way with his aesthetic tools, with an aesthetic tool, and he says, I'm touched, I'm impressed by the dignity by which you say that. So this should be a message for the client that the therapist has got the intentionality.
Yes, it's interesting because I've been trained to say things like that. For example, with a very devaluing patient, to say, I am so impressed that you're able to find every mistake I ever make. Nobody has appreciated all my defects quite as brilliantly as you. But I think I would explain it in a different language, what that does. But there is some effort there to note the intentionality and detoxify it, because it's not saying you shouldn't have done that. It's saying, I get that there's a hostile intent, and isn't it attractive in some kind of way?
Yes, and you do that to save yourself, not to kill the other or to destroy the object.
And it also helps the therapist save the therapist's sense of self, because in being so devalued, you find some way to turn it into humor or appreciation. You feel better about your own self.
Yes. So probably this is the suffering of many people today.
Yes, I think so.
Sometimes I think to people who kill other people with no reasons, or they even kill their parents with no reasons, with primitive tools like knives or things like that. What do you think of this? Do you think they could be included in this kind of suffering, or it's another thing?
I think people who do those kinds of extreme behaviors are often roughly in the borderline range of people. And I have the impression that in their histories they haven't felt anyone's devotion. One of the things that's happening to people these days is, at least in the United States, it's very hard to get long-term devoted therapy. There's the idea you should come in and have a quick intervention and it should be fine. So some of the people who've committed these horrific crimes, they've seen therapists before, but they've told, okay, you had therapy, it didn't work, let's put you on a medication. Being treated like an object that way, and have people throw medication at you, and have your parents feel like, the doctor thinks you need to be drugged. The child can feel that as such an affront to their humanity that they have to do something that restores some sense that they're in control. And they're in a rage, of course.
Yes. And it's a lack of relationship, intimate relationship. Like, it's a repetition of a schema, relational schema. Yes.
I think so. And I'm nervous about the future, because more and more one sees parents who aren't relating to children. They're on their cell phone. And the child is sort of an accessory. It's hard to find families that really enjoy parenthood for many reasons. Most of them having to involving economy and having to work. And
it's very true. We have much to do.
Yes.
Okay. So, do you want to say something else, or?
Oh, I want to thank you for inviting me to this beautiful place, and also for stretching my mind into a better understanding of Gestalt therapy, because I was exposed to it early in my career, but I had something of a negative reaction to Fritz Perls based on my personality, which is very sensitive to any domination by charismatic men. I immediately want to fight. And probably if I'd been his patient, he could have done something positive with that. But I was put off by the idea of his style.
Yes.
And so I went in a different direction. And I have lost contact with where...
Because you knew Persephone Goodman book, and you told me that you in the early years, of Gestalt therapy, you knew Gestalt therapy.
A little bit. I mean, I was influenced by some of the ideas. The idea that every image in a dream is the dreamer, and also it's about the therapy, and it's about the therapist. The empty chair technique interested me as a technique. I had colleagues. My colleague Jill Stein, with whom I wrote one of my earliest papers, was trained in Gestalt. So I have been influenced, but I haven't witnessed its evolution over the past decade.
It was very clear for you that was not for you.
That's right, at that time.
At that time, yes. Okay. So thank you very much for the time that you gave for this interview.
My pleasure.
I learned a lot from you, and I really much enjoy the way you are.
Thank you. Likewise.
Okay.